Oh, hi there! We hope that today you can listen carefully and enjoy our puppet show of the Korean War. Have fun!
Hello everyone, today I'm gonna be talking about the Demilitarized Zone, or by short DMZ, and the 38th parallel. The Demilitarized Zone is a huge wall that divides the South and North Korea. It's a border barrier that divides the Korean peninsula roughly in half. It was established to serve as a buffer zone between the countries of North and South Korea under the provisions of the Korean Armistice Agreement in 1953, an agreement between North Korea, China, and the United States Command. The purpose of the DMZ is to protect both sides of the attack. If North Korea was going to attack South Korea, they would have to pass through this tract of land, giving South Korea a short amount of time to alert that an attack was imminent. Additionally, this allows both sides to be better prepared in their defenses. Now we're gonna be talking about Douglas MacArthur, the person you can see right here. MacArthur, a general in the United States, was born on January the 26th in 1880. When the Korean War began, he was soon selected to command the United States forces there. He tracked North Korean steps to Busan and carried a daring land in Incheon in September, and advanced to North Korea in October, as the North Korean army soon disintegrated. However, a Chinese force attacked the divided army of MacArthur, forcing it to return and retreat to below Seoul. 2 months later, his troops returned to the offensive, driving their way back to the North Korea. Finally, on April the 11th, MacArthur was released from his command because he was accused of being unwilling and undisciplined to lead a war. Thank you. Now we'll talk about Harry Truman. Harry Truman, right here, was the President of the United States, born May the 8th from 1884. After a North Korean attack, Truman became furious. However, he never asked the Congress for a declaration of war, which he was later very criticized for. His first act was to send MacArthur to repel the invasion. Then, he commanded the American troops to be sent to the tip of the Korean peninsula. This tragedy was MacArthur gave Americans a victory. But they wanted more. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured into the North Korea. MacArthur asked to invade China and use nuclear weapons to gain control. That's when Truman removed him from the command. Past the end of the Truman's presidency, when dragged by the war, which made him responsible for the death of more than 33,000 American lives, as well as leaving a bitterness at home. Thank you. To finish this, we're gonna be talking about the surroundings and the map of North and South Korea. First, we have North and South Korea right here. Then we have China right on top of North Korea, Russia over here, and right in the bottom it's Japan, near South Korea.
The 38th parallel was the popular name, given to a part in East Asia that roughly demarcated North Korea and South Korea, also the DMZ, which was explained before. So, one of the battles of the Korean War was the Battle of Incheon. This was a battle that resulted in a decisive victory and strategic reversal in favor of the United Nations command. Next, we have the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter, one of the most important battles of the Korean War, actually, in which United Nations forces held out for 6 weeks on the southern eastern tip of the peninsula. This battle can be considered the turning point of the war. Now we have the Cairo Conference. The Cairo Conference occurred from November 22 to 26 of 1943. It was held in Cairo, Egypt, and it outlined the Allied positions against the Empire of Japan during World War II and made decisions about post-war Asia. So now you can see right here the Japanese Empire. It was a historical nation and a great power that existed from the Meiji Restoration in 1868 until the enhancement of the post-World War II 1947 constitution and subsequent formation of modern Japan. Next, we have the Korean Armistice Agreement. It is an armistice that brought about a complete cessation of hostiles of the Korean War. Now, we have the Korean Peninsula. It is an Asian peninsula of Manchuria that separates the Yellow Sea and the Sea of Japan. Now, North Korea, officially the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is a country in East Asia constituting the northern part of the Korean Peninsula, as you could see in the picture before. And in the south, we now have South Korea, which is a country of Eastern Asia at the southern end of the Korean Peninsula. Finally, Resolution 83 was an authorized member states to provide military assistance to South Korea. This determined that the attack on the Republic of Korea by forces from North Korea constituted a breach of peace.
Thank you, Katherine. Now we're going to be talking about the Empire of Japan, who ruled the Korean Peninsula from 1910 to 1945. The Cairo Conference. You might be thinking, what's that? And when did it take place? The Cairo Conference took place November of 1943. The US President Franklin Roosevelt met with Chinese President Chiang Kai-shek and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in Cairo, Egypt. And what did the leaders discuss? The progress of the war against Japan and the future of Asia. It was decided that the peninsula should become a free and independent country. Now that we know what is a demilitarized zone and the 38th parallel, you might be thinking, what did it mark? As we stated before, the 38th parallel and the demilitarized zone marked a boundary between North Korea and South Korea. Now, who controlled the North and the South? The South was controlled by the United States, while the North was controlled by the Soviet Union and the Communist China. Now, who attacked first to start the Korean War? The South or the North? The United States and the Soviet Union divided Korea along the 30th parallel into two zones of occupation. The Soviets administered the North Zone and the Americans administered the Southern Zone. And what day was this attack? This attack was June 25 of 1950. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valencia. And did you also know that this attack happened about 4 years after World War II had ended? And sadly, after 12 days of maneuvering, tense standoffs, and often bloody battles, Seoul was finally under the command and control of UN forces. Later, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 83, adopted on June 27, 1950, determined that the attack on the Republic of Korea by forces from North Korea constituted a breach of peace. So this was what the Resolution 83 entailed. Many battles took place during the Korean War, and one of them was the Battle of Pusan Perimeter, which my colleague talked before actually. It was relevant because that victory, the defense of the Pusan Perimeter in the first months of the Korean War, gave United Nations forces time to assemble the men, equipment, and political will necessary to start the first communist military fierce attack of the Cold War. Another battle was the Battle of Incheon, and it happened in 1950, which began on September 15 and ended 4 days later on September 19. This was commanded by U.S. General of the Army, Douglas MacArthur, and the battle ended a string of victories by the Northern Korean People's Armies, the KPA, and thus the subsequent UN recapture of Seoul partially served the KPA's supply lines in South Korea. After 1945, the USSR supplied the economic and military aid that enabled North Korea to mount its invasion of South Korea in 1950, and Soviet aid and influence continued at a high level during the Korean War. Later, it was noticed that MacArthur was fired. So, on April 11, 1951, US President Harry S. Truman relieved General of the Army Douglas MacArthur of his commands after MacArthur, made public statements which contradicted the administration policies. So most of the Americans were against Truman's actions, but the president stuck to his decision without regret or apology. Then, eventually, MacArthur did just fade away, and the American people finally began to understand that MacArthur's policies and recommendations might have actually led to a massively expanded war in Asia. So they finally ended being in the side of Truman. Finally, the Korean armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, and thankfully it formally ended the war in Korea. North and South Korea remained separate and occupied almost the same territory they had when the war began. Oh, hello. So now, friends, we'll be making a quick summary about everything mentioned, and don't worry, it'll be quick, right? Okay. So, at the end of the Second World War, Korea, which had formerly been occupied by the Japanese, was divided along the 38th parallel. This was an internal border between North and South Korea. The North fell apart rapidly under the influence of the Soviet Union, while the South relied on the support of the United States. Yes, that's true. And the Korean People's Army, the KPA, was established in North Korea in 1948, but were trained by Soviet people. By mid-1950, the KPA was composed of 223,000 men. On June 25 of 1950, the KPA invaded South Korea and advanced southward to trap South Korea and American troops in a small perimeter around the port of Pusan. The United Nations immediately encouraged its members to support the South, and many countries sent in troops included the United States, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, and South Africa. Yes, and later the United Nations Commander General MacArthur ordered an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port halfway up the Korean peninsula. His forces were able to drive the KPA back into the north and up the Yalu River and border between China and North Korea. That was the border. At this point, China entered the war and again pushed United Nations forces back into the south, but since the armistice negotiations had little initial success, the opposing armies continued to fight each other in trenches for the next 2 years. And finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed agreeing that Korea would remain a divided country. Yes, this is very good to know, and thank you so much for listening to us and for this quick summary.
So now that you know all the basic concepts of the war, we'll be taking a fun short exam to test your knowledge. Please join the Kahoot below.